Thank you for joining us today for Building Sustainability into a Volunteer Program. I'm Andy King, a training specialist with the Corporation for National and Community Service, and I'll be your host for today's session. Joining me are Bethany DeSoblin and Sam Graziani, our producers with Education Northwest and JBS. They've helped to prepare today's webinar, and they'll be managing our technology. You'll also see them in the chat and the Q&A to help you get your questions answered during the session. And it's now my honor and pleasure to welcome our main speaker today. Jennifer Bennett is with Volunteer Match, and she joined Volunteer Match to formalize and manage the organization's volunteer engagement program. With her breadth of experience, Jennifer is well suited to help Volunteer Match's community of nonprofits to better recruit and engage volunteers. Jennifer shares her knowledge with volunteer managers through webinars and newsletters and blog entries, and she does a lot in person at conferences around the country. She serves on the planning committee for the volunteer engagement and capacity building tracks for the Points of Light Conference on Volunteering and Service. And Jennifer is a strong believer in the importance of engaging volunteers in meaningful work, and she was certified in volunteer administration in 2009, and then she joined the board of the Council for Certification in Volunteer Administration in 2012, and Jennifer is currently the board chair for that organization. A little later on in today's presentation, we're going to hear from one of your colleagues, Charlotte Castro, who recently completed her VISTA service with Georgia 4-H in Athens, Georgia, where she worked with with the 4-H military youth programs. She wrapped up her VISTA year back in February, and now she continues to work with Georgia 4-H as a program assistant. So we'll be hearing from Charlotte a little bit later on. Now here's what we hope you'll get out of today's webinar. We'd like you to be able to describe at least 3 things that today's volunteers are looking for in a volunteer experience. We then hope you'll be able to take a look at your own volunteer program to see what it might look like to potential volunteers. And then you'll hopefully be able to identify areas where engaging volunteers could make your volunteer program itself stronger and more sustainable. And now I'm going to turn things over to our main presenter, Jennifer Bennett. Jennifer?
Thanks, Andy. I'm really excited to be here with you guys this morning. We've got some great chats coming in from our first chat question, but we're going to go ahead and ask you another question, have you share a little bit more about what you think are some of the challenges that you face in building a sustainable volunteer program. So go ahead and enter some of your ideas into the chat box, and make sure to send to all participants. We want your comments to be visible to everyone, so please be sure to enter them in the chat panel and not in the Q&A panel further on down the screen. All right.
Yeah, and we've got a really active group, lots of chats already coming in. So some of the challenges folks have talked about are finding staff or others who can take on the program after the VISTA member leaves. Other folks have talked about just getting the right kinds of volunteers and being able to bring in folks who have the skills that they need.
Great.
Yeah, those things. Funding to keep the volunteer program going, strategic planning, and replacing volunteers as they wrap up their service and move on from the program. Yeah, other things like paperwork. The burden of reporting and keeping up with systems management and data entry. So those are, invariably go along with the volunteer program. And then another one that stood out for me was maintaining volunteer satisfaction.
Yeah, those are really great challenges, and some of them we'll be addressing today. Unfortunately, I don't think we can get to all of them. I know paperwork and reporting is sort of always a burden that falls onto our programs. But we are going to talk today definitely about making sure we're bringing our volunteers in and giving them the experience that they're looking for. And then, of course, that sustainability piece. How do we make sure that we build a program that volunteers are engaged in so that they have the ownership and the responsibility as well to make sure that our programs move forward, even if volunteers move on or as we move on from the programs, that there's still a core of volunteers there to help us bring it forward. All right, thank you. So what do we know about volunteers? At Volunteer Match, we are really lucky to be able to sit at sort of the top of all of this volunteer activity that happens in our network. And every few years or so, we ask volunteers to share what they're looking for. And when we ask about a volunteer experience, what encourages a volunteer to select an opportunity or to select an organization, they tell us overwhelmingly that they want to make an impact, so they want to change something in their community. They want to make sure it fits their schedule. There were some comments about finding volunteers on weekdays and having some of that flexibility. We want to make sure that our opportunities work for what our volunteers need in their life with their schedule. And then overwhelmingly, they tell us that they want to find a cause they care about. And we really want to make sure that we are thinking about this when we're designing our opportunities, when we're thinking about what needs to get done in our organizations, tasks and activities. We want to make sure that we're telling our whole story. Sometimes volunteers Sometimes we start our conversation with volunteers in the middle. We start with what needs to get done. We start with what we need, and it's really important that we make sure we start our story at the beginning, what our organizations do, why it's important, how a volunteer can make a difference, not just telling the volunteers what we need to have done in our organization or what the tasks are. It's important to share the why. Our volunteers are really looking for why the work matters, how they can make a difference in all aspects of volunteer engagement. We also want to make sure we're managing those expectations, that we're matching the motivation of that volunteer, what they want to do, how they want to make an impact, and to make sure that we're creating that meaningful work for volunteers in our organization. So we're going to talk about that today. Are we okay with audio? All right, I'll push. Okay. So when I was working on this training and thinking about what would be a good metaphor for what a volunteer program looks like or feels like to a volunteer, I came up with this road analogy. Sometimes our programs feel like a cul-de-sac, literally a dead end. When we have just a few opportunities for our volunteers to do, or volunteers are very siloed into one part of an organization, there's really nowhere to go when you get there. This is sometimes when we feel like we have volunteers that have an expiration date. They come for a few weeks or a few months and then they move on because there's nowhere for them to grow. There's no opportunity for them to learn new skills or to move forward. We also sometimes get country road models. Country roads can be very pretty, and if you have a lot of time, they can be a fun day trip. But for volunteers who want to come into an organization and make an impact and see the difference that they're making, it can feel like it takes too long, right? They may not know how long it will take to get to where they're going. It's definitely not necessarily the most direct way to get to a place. This happens particularly in grassroots organizations or organizations that have been all volunteer run. It sort of evolves organically and naturally, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there are clear processes or clear pathways in place in the organization. We want to make sure that volunteers have that opportunity to take on more responsibility or learn new skills or maybe even create their own roles. And this can happen in a country road model, but it can be unclear how that happens. It might take a really long time, or it might be sort of mysterious. Some people just get tapped on the shoulder and get to be shift leaders or team leaders or take on more responsibility within the organization. But we know that volunteers want to make sure that they're using their time effectively, and they may not hang in there. They may not want to put in their time with your organization to actually get to that role, be able to have that role. What we want to think about is having our program be a highway. It's that direct route to impact and engagement. We want to think about that getting on that highway. There are clear on-ramps. There are signs that tell you how far it's going to take you to get somewhere. You can plan ahead. If you need to get off and take a break, there are easy exits, stop to get gas or get a snack, and there's easy signs that tell you how to get back on. We want to think about our program in that way. We want to be clear with how long it might take for a volunteer to get up to speed in our organization, how long we expect them to be with our organization, if their life situation changes, if they need to take a step back or take a step forward. It's clear how that happens. We need to develop programs that have the strong foundation, strong components in place to allow our physician descriptions to be clear with responsibilities, know what's expected of that volunteer, and the volunteer knows what they're expected to do and what you're expecting of them. We need to make sure that we're screening our volunteers, that we're putting our volunteers in the right roles. We're taking into consideration their skills, their experiences, their characteristics, and matching them up with the right role for them in our organization. We want to make sure we're setting them up for success. We really want to think about that on-ramp to impact, and we want to think about that flexibility. If I only have a few hours a week or a couple of weeks before I need to move back to my regular job or the kids go back to school, whatever that might be, I want to know what I can accomplish. That's where our signs come into place. And if I do need to take that step back, I have that opportunity to get off, take a break, and come back on in a new capacity. So today, as we go through and talk about this idea of building some components into our program to better engage volunteers, think about what your program looks like to a new volunteer when they come in, and think about what it might look like or feel like to a volunteer who's been with your organization for a while. So today we're going to talk about involvement, getting volunteers more involved in our organization, making sure that they have the training and the opportunities that they're looking for to stay with our organization. We're also going to talk about flexibility. How do we create more types of opportunities, project-based or less time-bound opportunities, so that volunteers can engage with us even if they aren't able to make it to our office or make it to our location on a regular basis. We also want to make sure that we're giving volunteers the information that they're looking for. I saw a couple of the chats that came in. They want to know what they're doing, how they're making a difference. They want to feel like they're part of something bigger. We want to give them that information. We want them to stay up to date. We're going to talk about how we can incorporate that understanding, that need for information into our recognition and connect that back to the impact. So how do we create this highway? We really want to make sure that we're giving volunteers those opportunities that they're looking for to make an impact. The impact needs to be meaningful. It needs to match the skills and interests of the volunteers. I like to think of this as one of those balance scales where you put something on one side and then you balance out with something on the other side. On one side, we have work that's meaningful to the volunteer. This is the work that they care about. This is why they've maybe come to your organization. On the other side, we have work that's important to the organization. We need to keep these in balance as much as possible. Sometimes they do get out of alignment. We may have work that a volunteer is doing that's very meaningful to them. Maybe they've even crafted their own role in your organization. But if that work isn't moving your mission forward, if it isn't important to your organization, that balance is out of alignment. Sometimes we see this get out of alignment the other way as well. We might have work that's really important to our organization, but if we don't do a good job of explaining why it's meaningful, or if we don't find the volunteers for whom that work is meaningful, we get out of alignment the other way. When we try to find that balance as much as possible, that's when we're matching talent to mission, impact, and meaning together. We start to harness that power of volunteers coming into our organization. One of the examples I like to use, particularly for work that can be very important for our organization, but we don't do a good job of explaining why it matters or finding the volunteer for whom it's meaningful, is data entry, right? We all know how hard it can be to pull information out of a database if the data hasn't been entered cleanly. But so often we sort of use that as a starting point or an entry point for volunteers. Assume that anybody can do data entry. We get data that's entered incorrectly or somebody who's not very detail-oriented, and that can have long-term impacts, negative impacts on our organization. We want to find that person who really understands data entry as it is. They care about clean data. They care about making sure that everything gets entered in the right way. So when we do that, we can sort of put that relationship back in balance. We also need to make sure that we're thinking about flexibility. Sometimes our organizations think, volunteers can't be here at this time and stay for this amount of hours and stay with us for years, then it's not worth it, right? We don't want to have to take volunteers out of their cul-de-sac. It starts to get a little bit more challenging. We have to work a little bit harder. But unfortunately, people don't just always do what you tell them to do. We need to work with our volunteers. Just because a volunteer needs flexibility, it doesn't mean that they can't be reliable, dependable, and accountable. We know that our volunteers have lives, and we want to make sure that their volunteering fits into the life that people have today. We don't want to drive volunteers away because we aren't able to provide the type of experience that they're looking for or find that opportunity that fits in with their schedule. Remember, that's the second most important thing they told us when we were talking, when we asked them to tell us what they were looking for in an opportunity. We need to create that strong foundation, position descriptions, volunteer handbooks, policies and procedures, so that we can create flexibility on top of those strong foundations. We can create that flexibility that volunteers are looking for. We don't want to be that cul-de-sac. We don't want to be just one way in and then you have to leave if it doesn't work for you. It sometimes feels easier to keep those volunteers in that cul-de-sac, that we keep them separated. We hope that no information gets in there, and we hope that the volunteers don't get out. But we know that volunteers want to know why. They want to understand why we do what we do in our organizations. They want to be a part of it. Sometimes I say we want our volunteers to feel like they're an important part of our organization, but it's actually that we want our volunteers to know that they're an important part of our organization. It shouldn't just feel that way. It should actually be that way. We want to share with our volunteers, engage with them, and the more they understand why we do the work that we do, the more they understand why it matters, the stronger that relationship will be, and the stronger our relationship with volunteers to our organization can be. All right, so I've been talking a lot about creating that strong foundation, and a lot of the things that can go into that that can help us incorporate flexibility and creativity into our programs come about when we think about creating training pathways or experience pathways within our organization. You may have volunteers that join you in one capacity. We want to be able to pull them into our organization and meet the needs that they're looking for in their experience. So to do that, we need to know what a volunteer needs to know or do or be to be the right volunteer for a role. So that is position descriptions, certainly policies and procedures that may apply to the work that volunteers are doing, and of course training programs to help them understand how the role fits into the organization, what they need to do to fulfill the needs of this role, and then also to help them decide if the role is the right fit for them. We want this to be a two-way street, that volunteers are saying yes to our opportunities and we're saying yes to volunteers. Sometimes, particularly in that country road model, some of this can feel a little mysterious. It's not clear how you get to move into certain roles or take on certain responsibilities, how certain volunteers get to have certain opportunities within an organization. You may have volunteers that come in expecting to be able to tutor children or work with animals in your animal shelter, but instead they end up filing papers or doing dishes for a couple of months, and then they leave because it wasn't what they were expecting. We weren't able to match the experience with their expectations. We want to make sure that we give them the experience that they are looking for, that they don't drop out because they never got to do the impact-driven work that they were expecting to be able to do, or even worse, that we promised them that they could do. And sometimes that happens, and you know, that bait and switch where we tell volunteers it's going to be amazing, you're going to be able to come and play with puppies, and then, you know, for 2 months they do dishes, and that's not what they were expecting, and it's not what they were promised. So we need to make sure that we create those experience pathways. There may be a point in time where they do need to do dishes and learn how to work with the animals, or go through a background check and get training to work with children, but we want to make sure that it's clear how long that's expected before they get to do that impact-driven work that they were expecting. We also want to be clear about how long we expect volunteers to be with our organization. If there are classes or skills they need to have to fill a role, is that information available? Are those classes offered? Can you share that with them? Again, sometimes this can feel really mysterious, and volunteers can feel like if I'm not the right person, if I don't know the right people, if I haven't been here long enough, then I'm not going to be able to do this role that I'm really interested in or I'm really excited to do. Sometimes our organizations fall back on longevity as a qualification for leadership roles or for certain experiences within our organization, and that can certainly be part of what you look for in a volunteer to move into these leadership roles, but we want to make sure that it's not our only qualification. That can keep a lot of volunteers out of our organization, might exclude some qualified volunteers who don't have years to give but can come in and move into a leadership role with skills or experiences that they bring with them. Also, sometimes when we have this kind of nebulous or mysterious feelings around how volunteer roles get selected or how people get to do certain things within our organization, it can create a culture that's not very welcoming for our newer volunteers. So it feels a little exclusive, or people can feel a little cliquey, and it can be hard for those volunteers to come in. That, of course, jeopardizes the sustainability of our program. Of course, if volunteers need certain types of experiences or skills that need to be learned on the job or in your organization, you want to make sure that you're providing those skills and classes. One of the best ways really to create more involvement in your program and to create, again, that sustainability is to invite volunteers to take on leadership roles. There might be opportunities in your organization to engage volunteers in your volunteer program, and we're going to talk a lot about that in the second half today. But think about things like subject matter experts or shift leaders, training teams, volunteers that are taking on some of that work that might fall traditionally under volunteer recruitment or volunteer management. You also want to think about how you can incorporate opportunities for volunteer engagement into leadership roles in your organization. Is there an opportunity to create an additional executive level committee or engage pro bono consultants? We know that not every volunteer wants to work with clients or deliver services. When we expand what it means to be a volunteer, start to think outside the box, take our volunteers out of that cul-de-sac and incorporate them into different levels in our organization, we can expand the type of people who want to volunteer with our organization. All right, next slide, please. So we've talked about flexibility and that need for flexibility in a volunteer engagement program, and that just because a volunteer needs flexibility doesn't mean that they can't be reliable and dependable and responsible for the work that we're asking them to do. We know that volunteers have lives. With that cul-de-sac model, a volunteer who can't or doesn't want to do the work that's offered won't volunteer with your organization. We need to start thinking about incorporating that flexibility, opening our organization up to a more sustainable model by changing what it means to be a volunteer. And flexibility doesn't mean less commitment. Some volunteers may need to take that step back, take that exit ramp and take a break, but when we have just one or two opportunities for volunteer engagement, it doesn't allow for growth with a volunteer. A volunteer can't take a step forward and become more involved in our organization. So we want to make sure we have the opportunity to both expand and contract the commitment that a volunteer brings to our organization. Contraction, especially with an opportunity that expands to future involvement, can actually lead to less turnover. So, for example, if you have a volunteer who comes to you and says, I need to stop volunteering with you, my life situation has changed, maybe a parent's gotten sick or a child's gotten sick or something has changed in their work life and they don't feel like volunteering fits into their schedule anymore. If you do have just one or two opportunities, then the response has to be, well, we're sorry to see you go. Let us know if your situation changes and you can come back. Instead, if we think a little bit more creatively or think about diversifying what it means to be a volunteer, maybe this volunteer could be a subject matter expert and work on some training materials or work on building out a process manual for something that you do in your organization while she's, at home or in her downtime, so she doesn't have to come to your organization to do that work, but you're still giving her an opportunity to make a difference. We're still connecting her with the cause that she cares about. We're still giving her an opportunity to make an impact in her community. And as we do that, so as we build those opportunities in place, it means less turnover with our volunteers and less time spent training new volunteers. So think about the roles that volunteers might be able to do on their own schedule, either work from their work or from home time or project-based opportunities. Again, that example of subject matter expert or maybe writing a blog article or doing some data entry from home if your database is online. There are a lot of ways when we start to think creatively about project-based or virtual opportunities that aren't just tied to those traditional roles in our organization. All right, so how do we start to bring more positions into our program? Again, we'll talk a lot about this in just a little bit. We can create more flexibility by inviting volunteers into the work that we do, empowering them to be part of that process, giving them ownership and buy-in. Volunteers know the work that they do better than probably anyone else in your organization. Consider inviting them in to write their own position descriptions, to help form policies and procedures, or training, or even recruiting and placing volunteers. They know the work that volunteers do. They know who's good at that work. Of course, we want to support them in this. We don't just want to turn our volunteers loose in our organization without support and training. But by inviting volunteers into our organization, we can expand the ways that we engage volunteers, as well as task volunteers with creating those new positions for organizations. They may have some great ideas, possibly work that they've always wanted to do with your organization, but weren't able to because they didn't have that opportunity. I saw a couple of the chats that came in about keeping volunteers informed, keeping volunteers up to date, and that's absolutely right on track with what we want to do to keep our volunteers, help them understand what we do. We want to keep them informed about what's going on. In that cul-de-sac model, it's really easy, right, to pull our volunteers to the side, and as I say, we don't want any information to get in because they might ask questions, and we don't want any volunteers to get out. We just want them to stay happy in their cul-de-sac. But that's there may be some thoughts on that in your organization, that volunteers don't need to know what's happening in the rest of the organization. This is sort of that lip service that we really value our volunteers, but we don't invite them into the conversation. We don't share with them. And this can be detrimental, right? If volunteers feel like they don't know why their work matters, if they aren't getting the information or the contact that they're looking for, they'll leave. In our country road model, sometimes we have trickle-down information. There may be a lot of gossiping happening or, sort of behind closed doors conversations. Again, this can create a culture that isn't welcoming. This doesn't help us build these long-term sustainable relationships with our volunteers. And this type of communication style doesn't help our volunteers care about our cause or help them understand the real impact that they make. We keep them separated. We keep them isolated. It's not the best way to build those relationships or to keep our volunteer programs sustainable. We want to think about professional development or ongoing training for our volunteers. Again, where are they going on your highway? What do they need to know to get there? How can you help them by supporting them with professional development, ongoing training, especially if there's new ideas or new theories that are happening in the work that you're doing. If your executive director goes to a conference or writes a paper or something new is happening, share that with your volunteers, invite them in. We definitely want to include volunteers in milestones in our organization. Are you doing updates, or do you have new town halls for new policies, new programs that are being introduced? We want our volunteers to be armed with that information so that they know they're an important part of the work that we do. They understand how their work makes an impact, and we want them to be good advocates for the work that we do when they go out into the community. We want them to have a story to tell. So how can we incorporate impact into that recognition? It's really easy to say thank you, right? Thanks so much for the time that you've given us this afternoon. Have a good week. See you next time. But it becomes really more important when we can incorporate the impact of what that volunteer has done. So can you incorporate what your paid staff or client's perspective into that thank you? Thank you. Because you were here today, we were able to accomplish X. And because you were able to accomplish X, now this can happen with our organization. So instead of just saying thank you for being here for 4 hours, it's, I talked to, if you're running an adult literacy program, I talked to Tom last week after he met with you, and he just is feeling so excited about the progress he's making. He's feeling much more confident going out, and he might even start looking for a better job, whatever that might be, to help connect those dots for that volunteer, that it's not just the value of their time, that there's real impact on your organization. It is great to say thank you at the end of that shift, or to have that annual party where you celebrate volunteers with other volunteers, social events, or an annual award ceremony. But that thank you becomes so much more powerful when we share it both inside and outside our organization. So make sure that paid staff know what's happening. When we say thank you in front of our clients or even the whole community, that really can resonate with volunteers. This is a great opportunity to think about social media as well, putting some of the impact of the work that volunteers do, or even having a volunteer of the month that's up on your Facebook page so that the community at large can see what volunteers do for your organization. It's recruitment and it's recognition, right? The more we tell that story, the more other volunteers are attracted to our organization. All right, now we're going to take a little time to hear from our guest speaker, Charlotte Castro.
Charlotte, you may want to check the mute on your phone.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. Can everyone hear me? I was having a little sound problem.
Yep, it sounds great.
Okay. Thank you for having me today. I'm very pleased to be here speaking with you. As Andy mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, I recently completed a one-year VISTA term with Georgia 4-H. And I'd like to just share with you an example from my host site in which I incorporated some of Jennifer's advice in giving volunteers an opportunity to make an impact, on being flexible and working within their schedules, and in giving volunteers an opportunity in a position which they can further understand our organization. And first, I'd like to just start by providing you with a little bit of context on my host site. Throughout my service year, I worked with the 4-H Military Partnership. The 4-H Military Partnership is a national collaboration between the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, the United States Department of Defense, and Army, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, and National Guard youth programs. So if you heard that list and you're not sure where 4-H fits in, you're not alone, but we actually fall under the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So from my host site, the State 4-H office, we coordinate, network, and facilitate programs working with partners across higher education, the military, and the state of Georgia in support of programming for military-connected children, youth, and their families. So what do we really do? We provide 4-H club meetings on the county level. We provide curriculum and professional development on the state level, and we provide youth and family camping opportunities on the state and national levels. So we mainly use our volunteers in a mentoring capacity. Our motto at 4-H is learn by doing, and we follow an experiential learning model to do positive youth development. So with an experiential learning model, you really want youth to experience things in an unbiased way and then share how their experiences were, process that information, generalize what they learned, and apply that to their lives. So right now we currently have volunteers actively engaged in this type of mentoring role in 158 of 159 counties in Georgia. So it's pretty easy to see from the context how we rely pretty heavily on our volunteers in all levels of our organization. Great. So I'd like to just outline the steps that I took in building sustainability into my volunteer program for you. I first started by assessing our current volunteer program, and I wanted to identify our target audience. And this was a group that I really felt like we could engage more to build long-term sustainability into our program. So my target audience I identified as military-connected community members that possess leadership qualities or positions, and they already had a desire to positively impact military youth. So they were already interested in my cause, and many times they were past or present program participants or parents. But not heavily involved within the organization, but they did have some sort of base knowledge about 4-H. So I evaluated my program next, and you really want to look for any gaps or weaknesses that you see. I noticed a weakness because we had very highly engaged military-connected volunteers, but we were only using them episodically or sporadically as adult leaders or chaperones at special events or camps. So we weren't giving them any sort of year-long volunteer opportunities. And I felt like when I evaluated my program, I could see how it would be pretty easy for our program to look like that country road model that Jennifer was talking about. You know, longevity really was a big factor in our volunteer positions that were leadership positions. And I really wanted to give volunteers a fast track to make change that they saw was important. So I wanted to create a balance between the needs of my organization and the volunteers' motivations. I knew based on my previous interactions with my target audience that they already wanted to share their knowledge and experiences, and I wanted to use them for the knowledge resources that they are. So I accomplished both of these goals by seeing them as subject matter experts for our military-connected youth. I really wanted to push these volunteers by creating a new position for my target audience that would shift them from being episodic mentors to a year-round position in which they were subject matter experts. So I did this by taking a volunteer position that we already have in our organization and just kind of tweaking it a little bit to be more marketable to specifically military-connected leaders in the community. So one type of role that we have with 4-H with Georgia 4-H is we have program development teams in each of our 159 counties. So some are a little bit bigger and some are more active, but each county has a team that's basically like an advisory board. The county agent is there, and there's a couple of other paid staff that are on the board, in addition to having community leaders be on that board. And they basically just provide input and opinions on the types of programs and events they want to see their youth involved in on the local level. So I created a specific military program development team member position. And this was a skills-based role that created a fast track to making a lasting impact for my volunteers. And it also brought military cultural competency and knowledge to my organization on a local and county level. So the next thing I did was plan and implement my change. And in the planning, that's really where you're going to get down to making your position description, your recruitment plan. I made a screening and interview protocol, and orientation and training materials. And I think that this is really one of the best places that you can start to involve your volunteers in the process if you haven't already. When you get your volunteers, your current volunteers, involved in the planning stage of implementing changes, by the time you get around to implementing them, they're already on board with what you're doing. Not only that, but it can be pretty time-consuming to create a position description, a recruitment plan, and a screening and interview. All that stuff takes a long time to do. So taking that resources and the information to your volunteers and asking for their input and opinions is a great way to help take some of that load off of your back. And I think it's important here to make sure that you're weaving your new position and resources that you're creating into your existing internal systems of your organization, kind of just to get a jump start on thinking about sustainability. So I did this by creating a website specifically for our military volunteers, in which I listed all the positions that we had offered with descriptions and next steps for how they could get involved. And I also integrated this website into the overall Georgia 4-H volunteer opportunity site. I made sure to disperse the resources that I created to our county agents through our listserv and make them aware of new program changes. And I really wanted to make sure to get the information out to my volunteers, my target audience, through social media, newsletters, and more local things on the county level. So I haven't seen a ton of outcomes and changes since implementing this because it is a really new program. And I think that it is worth mentioning that in reality, I probably will never see some of the outcomes for the changes that I've implemented throughout my VISTA year, just because I am going to be moving on, and sustainability is a long-term process. So don't be discouraged if you don't feel like you're getting a huge impact with the differences that you're making in your volunteer program. So how are you getting your information out to your volunteers? I really think it's important here to reinforce your on-ramp success and make sure that your information is easily accessible to your target audience. Not only that, but make sure that you're taking your information to your current volunteer base and asking them for help, engaging them in the process of your volunteer program and maintaining that program is really, they get a lot of return from that and being a part of your organization. I think it's important to create an inclusive environment and then show your volunteers that you value them by asking for their opinions or advice in areas where they're already experts. And I think that this is something that comes naturally with 4-H, is that we already kind of have that sense of belonging and ownership built into our organization based on people's past experiences there. And then, of course, don't forget to say thank you for your new, but also your current volunteers for helping you along through this process. So in this example, I have evaluated our current volunteer program and created flexibility. I created a new position by making adjustments to an existing one. And in creating this position, I gave our volunteers a clear ramp to make an impact. Lastly, I also placed our volunteers in a leadership role that helped them better understand our organization and how we make an impact in their own local community. I supported this understanding by making the information and resources they needed accessible across all mediums of correspondence. And that is my example of my how I built sustainability into my volunteer program.
Great, thank you, Charlotte. What a great example of really starting to think creatively and incorporating that flexibility and starting to really hone in on what a volunteer needs to know or do or be to be that right volunteer, and taking that step back and asking if longevity is really an important piece for leadership. So we're going to talk now about how you can start to invite volunteers in. Charlotte mentioned how important it was for volunteers to be part of that process, and it is. When we invite volunteers in to help us sustain our program, we can expand what we can accomplish. We can start being the leader of volunteer engagement in our organizations instead of just being the doer of volunteer engagement. We sometimes feel like we can be on that hamster wheel, right, just running as fast as we can just to stay in the same place. But we need to take that step back and maybe delegate or share some of those responsibilities or those roles in day-to-day recruitment, management, placement, training, so that we can be that leader. We're going to discuss how we can incorporate meaningful roles, how we can establish some clear responsibilities for volunteers, provide support and training for volunteers to step into new roles, as well as empower volunteers to solve problems around volunteer engagement to create sustainability. So we'll be thinking about how to involve volunteers in this type of work in our organizations. We have another chat question. As you've been listening today to me and to Charlotte, what are some of the ways that volunteers can help make your volunteer program more sustainable? Are there actions or activities that you might be able to delegate? If you want to take a few minutes and type your ideas into the chat box, remember to send to all participants and to use the chat panel, not the Q&A panel.
Yeah, so we've got some chat ideas coming in already through the chat. Mentoring new volunteers is one thing that volunteers could do. Let's see, give them leadership positions so that they can train other volunteers. Let's see, engaging them in the whole analysis process, getting them to identify barriers to sustainability and doing some troubleshooting and planning for the future around that. Using volunteers as recruiters to keep new volunteers coming into the program, and also in recognition. And earlier there was a lot of chat about volunteer recognition, and of course you can engage your volunteers in recognizing other volunteers. So lots of ideas, and they're still pouring in, so it's hard to keep up with all of them. Let's see. Exit surveys, finding out what they learned about the program, what they would do differently, building buy-in, planning meetings, focus groups. So tons of ideas here.
Tons of ideas.
Yeah.
Great. Well, maybe we can, we'll move forward and talk about that. And Andy, feel free to jump in if there are some examples that fit in with what we're talking about. So we're going to talk next about how we can start to really create those meaningful roles. Remember, we know that volunteers want that opportunity to make an impact. So when we think about the opportunity for maybe providing training or being that subject matter expert, especially for a volunteer for whom that, you know, they want to pass that information along. They may be naturally good trainers or naturally good relationship builders. We want to make sure that we're creating a set of tasks or components as well as the opportunities for leadership. So it's not just saying, I need you to post these opportunities, or we need to create position descriptions for these roles. It's really giving volunteers the opportunity to step in and say, I think we could use a role that does something like this, and I'm happy to write a position description for that. We want to make sure that we're incorporating that impact, again, into this role. When we're designing something, we're not just thinking about what needs to get done, but why it matters to our organization and what type of volunteer might be excited or interested to help in this way. We don't just want to think about skills, whether those are professional level skills or personal skills that a volunteer brings to your organization. We also want to think about our volunteers' strengths. Some people are extroverted and naturally better at talking in public or reaching out to strangers. Others might be more introverted and want to work on a project independently and not interact with clients or the public. So we want to think about how our volunteers' skills and strengths align with our needs. We also want to think about priorities, both in our volunteer engagement program and in the organization. So are there opportunities for volunteers to get involved to solve an immediate problem? Or if you have a program that's struggling to attract volunteers, that might be a good place to start, put some time and energy there. This is really where we get an opportunity to invite volunteers in and to give them a way to build a stronger relationship with our organizations. It's also a really great way, as Charlotte said, to build that buy-in for changes to your volunteer program. Volunteers are invested and they want to see those changes happen. We also, next slide please. Yes, we also want to make sure that we're clear, right? Position descriptions with clear responsibilities. When we are delegating something or creating something like a recruitment team or a placement team or a training team, we want to make sure that we know what the volunteers are going to be responsible for, they know what they're responsible for, and everybody's on the same page. I like to talk about an authority continuum. An authority continuum is sort of a continuum of decision-making or responsibilities. So if, for example, I have volunteers that are responsible for screening and placing volunteers in my organization, I might have a set of criteria that says if a volunteer comes in and their background check is clear and they've gone through an interview and you've gotten standard responses to questions, you as this placement counselor, volunteer, have the authority to place that volunteer in our organization in whatever capacity makes the most sense for that volunteer. There may be another set of criteria where maybe the background check has something on it that's not very alarming, but potentially could be a problem, or during the interview process there were a couple of red flags or maybe some answers that didn't feel exactly right to the questions that you were asking. In that case, that placement counselor volunteer then needs to check with either the supervisor, the team leader, maybe you, and together you work out whether that volunteer is a good fit for your organization or a good fit for that role. And then there would be another set of criteria. Maybe there's something really concerning that comes back on the background check. The volunteer was not personable or maybe was aggressive during the interviews, didn't answer questions in the way that you would expect at all. And that placement counselor or volunteer knows that it's not their responsibility to say no to that volunteer or to take it to the next step. They either elevate it to, again, that team leader or supervisor, or again to you as that leader of volunteer engagement. So that's what that authority continuum looks like. And for each role, we want to make sure we have an authority continuum where a volunteer knows they have the authority to make a decision or where their responsibility lies, where they can move forward after checking in or getting approval, and where it falls outside of their responsibilities, where it's outside of their authority level. So that way we don't have volunteers that have to ask each time, what should I do next, or do I have the authority to do this? And we don't want volunteers to get in sort of over their head or find themselves in an uncomfortable situation without that support of a supervisor, a team leader, or you. So we want to make sure that we think too of, great. So we also, that's good, we can move forward. We also want to make sure that we provide support for these volunteers. Again, it might seem very challenging to spend the time to get volunteers up to speed to do some of these actions that we're asking, that maybe take on new roles in your organization or redefine what it means to be a volunteer in your organization. We want to make sure that we're providing training and support. Working with volunteers is really challenging. We all know that. And it can be just as challenging for a volunteer working with volunteers as it could be for paid staff. So make sure that you're sharing resources, you're providing training and support for these volunteers as they step into these new roles, just like you would for any other organization, or any other role in your organization. You wouldn't, put volunteers onto the floor of your food bank and expect them to know how to drive a forklift without providing training and support and a skills checklist. So make sure you're doing the same when you invite volunteers into your volunteer engagement program. You also want to make sure that you're checking in, building in those evaluation points, and asking for feedback. How is this working? Are there any questions? Do we need to reevaluate where your authority lies, or what kinds of questions you're bringing to me? Can we create something so that you have an answer, or you can find an answer on your own? Okay. We want to make sure we're getting feedback not just from the volunteers, but from paid staff or clients that might be working with those volunteers in this new role. For example, as a volunteer comes in, coming through the new placement counselor role asking, how was the recruitment process, or what was the onboarding process like? Do you feel like you learned the things you needed to start here? And then that feedback can go back to your training team or to your placement counselors. Just want to make sure that we're sharing those resources and strategies that we have. So coming to a webinar like this or doing some reading or a blog article that sparks something, pass that along to your volunteers who are working with volunteers in your organization, as shift leaders or training team members, whatever that might be. Help them tap into the resources that are out there. You might also want to consider creating a peer group for those working with volunteers in your organization. Brown bags or lunchtime conversations where they can come together and share their challenges or work to find solutions together. We also want to look for, again, more of those opportunities for leadership. Do you have volunteers that are natural leaders or naturally rise to take on some skills within your organization or have those characteristics that make them better? That can be a really great role, a great way to tap into this. I was doing a training and volunteer program manager said she really hated public speaking and was really worried about doing orientations and sort of had to pretend to be someone else. And I said, if that's the part of your job that you dread the most, what a great way to engage a volunteer in this process. If orientations and public speaking terrify you, find somebody for whom public speaking is an exciting thing to do. They are out there, and you can build those roles into your program. It can feel like a lot of work to train and support volunteers moving into these new roles, and a lot of times it feels easier and faster to just do it ourselves, but then we're on that hamster wheel, right, running as fast as we can. And while providing the training and support for volunteers that do this work to recruit and manage volunteers may feel like it's taking too much time out of your daily work, if you just keep doing everything yourself, your program is absolutely limited by you. And then nothing carries on after your service is over. All right, so we want to empower those volunteers, right? How do we do that? We can ask our volunteers how they want to be part of our organization. What do they want to do? What are they good at? What ideas do they have? Do they have unique skills that they bring to your organization? Do they have ideas for how to create better recruitment processes or better training programs so that the volunteers that are joining their shifts or their teams or working with them are better trained and can hit the ground running? Again, we want to make sure we're providing that ongoing support. This is not here, take these and work on this and talk to me in a month, right? We want to provide that ongoing support. And the work will evolve. Our role really becomes about clearing away obstacles and barriers so that volunteers have the opportunity to make that impact, create new opportunities for themselves and for other volunteers. And we want to make sure that we're thinking about what those challenges are, what the challenges volunteers might face in these new roles, and really being the one to help set them up for success. Don't get stuck in how you've always done something, or get stuck with a mindset about how you would do something. You really want to empower your volunteers to think creatively. Just because it's always been done some way, a certain way, or just because you might approach a problem in a certain way doesn't mean that that's the only way to do it. So we want to really take that step back and focus on those outcomes and focus on deliverables and allow volunteers to be creative, sort of re-envision the work that they do and the work that other volunteers do in the organization. Remember, with that authority continuum, we've given volunteers the opportunity to make decisions or to be responsible in a way that we're all okay with and a way that allows them to make that work their own. All right. So that creating that strategic plan for volunteer engagement, if you think about your program, what will it look like in 3 or 5 years? As Charlotte said, you may not be there for that. You may not get to see the outcomes of what the groundwork that you lay turns into in those years, but you have to start somewhere, and we have to start with that idea of where we want to go. Think about what your program looks like or feels like to that volunteer, and envision a program you really want to have. How can volunteers take on more responsibilities, step into leadership roles? How can you tap into the time and talent of volunteers so that you are not stuck on that hamster wheel? do not do this yourself. First of all, it's too much work. As Charlotte said, you know, it feels overwhelming, all the work that has to get done. It's very time-consuming. And the more we invite volunteers into this process, or we invite a group of paid staff and volunteers into this process, the more buy-in and more support there is for the work that moves forward. There may be an easier starting point, something that feels easier to do, or the natural entry point, possibly identifying the roles and responsibilities that you have right now. If you don't have position descriptions in place, that can be a first step to help you identify where there are holes or where there might be opportunities to create leadership roles in your organization. Maybe, again, thinking about how those systems fit together and thinking about what training or skills volunteers need to know to be able to do them. All right, so for next steps, getting started, really think about what your program looks like, or feels like to a volunteer, either one who's new to your organization, just starting to get involved or wanting to get involved, and for volunteers that have been there for a while. Particularly if you have that expiration date for your volunteers, where do they drop out? Talk to them, surveys, focus groups, informal conversations. How can you get this conversation started? And look at where volunteers are dropping out. Is there an opportunity to think about more involvement, more flexibility, creating that understanding and that connection to your organization and your mission, right? Volunteers want to understand. They want to be involved, but they might need to do it on their own schedule. We want to think about that as we're designing our programs. Think about how volunteers can step into new roles, or how you might be able to engage volunteers with professional level skills. If you're not good at designing position descriptions, if you don't have that skill set, or you're not comfortable creating a training team, there are people out there that have those professional level skills who might be able to come in as a consultant level volunteer. All right. So I have a few resources for you moving forward. Certainly, Volunteer Match's Learning Center, we do free webinars like this. Every month, we have quite a few of those core components. So if you're thinking about creating a volunteer interviewing team, or putting a team together to create position descriptions or a handbook, that's a great place to start. I'm a little biased because it's my work, but I do think there's a lot out there, both introductory and advanced topics for people in this field. Energize Inc., some of you may be familiar with that website, a lot of those sort of big picture topics and resources that are available, and then a few blogs that I really like. I feel the more that I spend time thinking about how volunteers are working in other organizations, or looking for good ideas, or challenging myself to think differently about volunteer engagement, can be very eye-opening or inspiring to know that, first of all, I'm not the only one out there that's struggling with this, and also there's some people out there, particularly Meredith Swift at Volunteer Plain Talk, who's just really putting it out there plainly and, you know, challenging some assumptions and talking about volunteer engagement with really real terms and real experiences. So remember, you do not have to do this all by yourself. There's some great resources, and when we invite volunteers in to participate in the work that we're doing in engaging volunteers, not only are we giving ourselves more time to be that leader of volunteer engagement, we're also creating a way for volunteers to be more involved with our organization. And by creating those ways for volunteers to be more involved, we're strengthening the relationship with our volunteers, and we're creating a much more sustainable volunteer engagement program. So thank you. It's been great to be able to present to you today, and I'll turn it back over to Sam.
Yeah, Andy here. So Jennifer, thank you so much for all of this tremendous information. Particularly, you shared some great resources there on that last slide. We did post those in the chat, and if any of you have additional resources that you'd like to share with your colleagues, we invite you to use the chat for that. I also want to point out that we now have our evaluation poll is open on the right side of your screen. 10 quick questions. You'll need to use the slider bar to scroll down to see all questions, but please do that. We'd love to get your feedback, what you thought of this session, and then ideas you might have for other sessions that we could offer in the future. Believe me, I go through all of those comments that people leave, and use your ideas for planning new sessions in the future. So really encourage you to do that. We are going to move to the Q&A session portion of our session here today. So I'm going to invite Terry, our operator, to come back on and give us instructions for asking a question by phone. So Terry?
Thank you, sir. At this time, if you would like to ask a question, there'll be *1 on your phone, *1 to ask a question. To withdraw your question, that will be * then 2. Once again, *1. You'll be asked to state your name prior to joining the queue. Please make sure your mute feature is off and you state your name clearly. One moment, please, for the first question.
Great. And while we're waiting for questions to come in by phone, I'll remind you that the Q&A panel is now collapsed. It's just above the poll, so if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A, not the chat, because I won't see it. Click on the triangle next to Q&A, put in your question there, and then click Submit. And we've got our first question comes from Erica. So Jennifer, she says, my host site is an environmental and recreation-focused organization in a 200-person town where many people are working multiple jobs just to make ends meet. How do I make volunteering worth their while and bring new people in?
Wow, that's a small community, and maybe the answer, the thing to think about might be engaging volunteers virtually. If the people who are in your most immediate area are limited in their time and their ability to volunteer, are there opportunities for volunteers outside who might be able to care about your cause, make an impact in your organization without coming to your facility? If you do need volunteers hands-on in your organization or with your recreation program, maybe doing some focus groups with the community, a coffee and cookies session where you can ask them, how do you want to get involved, or tell them more about the work that you do and what it means to the community, and make it as easy as possible for people who may have limited time to drop in and help out. So again, thinking about that flexibility component and thinking creatively and inviting them to say what they'd like to do or how they'd like to participate.
Great. Next up, we have a question from Kenneth, who asks, what are some settings where recruiting volunteers from court-ordered community service programs may be effective and appropriate?
Yeah, I think that bringing in court-ordered volunteers or volunteers with those court-ordered hours, you want to be really clear about where you feel comfortable as an organization inviting those volunteers in. Do you have policies around only taking those volunteers who don't have, for example, violent offenses on their background? A speeding ticket is a lot different than something that's much more aggressive. And thinking about work that can be done with not a lot of training. If those volunteers are not going to stick around, we won't want to spend too much time, investing in training if they're going to leave at the end of their service. But I also encourage you to think about giving those volunteers an opportunity to become a long-term part of your organization. I got my start in the wildlife rehabilitation and conservation field, and one superstar volunteer that stands out to me came in as a court-ordered volunteer, and she ended up staying with us for several years and actually working as a foster volunteer for swallows, so feeding baby birds around the clock throughout the spring. So just because somebody comes to you because someone's ordered them to volunteer to give back to the community doesn't mean that they can't also be a great long-term volunteer.
All right, great. Terry, do we have any callers on the line with questions?
I'm showing no questions at this time, sir.
Okay, great. Well, we've got plenty of them here in the Q&A, so we'll keep going on. Cassie asks a question. It sounds very familiar. She says, our staff is enthusiastic about getting more volunteer involvement, but they don't have time to manage volunteers. It looks like getting volunteers involved will mean that the VISTA ends up managing them. Is this capacity building?
That is a very familiar question and a very familiar situation. And sometimes in our organizations, historically, the volunteer program manager or the volunteer coordinator was the one who was responsible for training and supervising all of those volunteers. Maybe there's somebody in your organization and the staff, from the staff side, that can see how them being responsible for managing and supervising that volunteer is better in the long run. Providing those training, support, and resources so that the staff person doesn't feel like they have to do it all by themselves. Again, maybe just creating a pilot program where you do the first few together, and then that staff person understands that we invest in our volunteers just like we would invest in paid staff, and that benefits in a long-term relationship. But a lot of that can take time. That's a shift in culture in our organizations. Don't feel discouraged. Again, maybe look for somebody in your organization that is that champion that you feel like you can work with, and use that as a pilot or a model to share with the rest of your organization the benefits of engaging volunteers in their work, even if it does feel like it takes more time up front to do that training and supervision. I do think for some reason a lot of times we think that volunteers should be able to hit the ground running. We would never hire someone and on their first day just say, you know what to do, go and do it, right? We would train them, we would provide orientation, we would invest in them as a paid staff person in our organization. We need to bring that same thoughtfulness and that same expectation to the volunteers that we invite into our organization too.
Great. And Jennifer, if I could add, just from the perspective of the VISTA program, we do really see the role of VISTA members in creating the systems for a volunteer program, so setting up the recruitment plan and the recruitment materials and creating the training for volunteers and setting up the database or the technology to manage volunteer information and scheduling and creating the roles and all of that work. But that the day-to-day management and supervision of volunteers really should not be the role of the VISTA, because as has been pointed out here, that's not a very sustainable approach, because as soon as you're gone, then who's doing the day-to-day management? So if you're in a situation like this, maybe a very small organization, and that's the case with a lot of VISTA projects, organizations that need capacity building work are not always the strongest organizations. They're typically small, typically grassroots, people wearing many hats, people overworked, so that's not unusual, and in fact it's to be expected. That's why they need and deserve VISTAs. So the approach that you might consider is engaging volunteers, creating a structure where volunteers then are leading and directing other volunteers. So earlier, Jennifer, you talked about the shift leader role. There could be team leaders or, volunteer supervisors. There's lots of different ways that can play out. But it is a way to engage volunteers in helping to manage the program and, in fact, to organize and coordinate other volunteers. And it turns out to be much more sustainable.
And if your organization is really small and struggling with those sort of overarching people management issues, that might be an opportunity to bring in a higher level skills-based volunteer with HR or organizational management or organizational development skills to be that person who can sustain that long-term capacity building.
Great. All right, we've got a number of more questions. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can here. So let's see. And some of them are focused on sustainability, some around volunteers. So Candace says, this presentation was focused mostly on individual volunteers, but do you have any advice on how to engage corporate volunteers in hopes of more funding? This is part of my VAD. That's her volunteer assignment description.
Certainly we want to think about building relationships with corporations or other community or organizations, community groups like Scouts or universities. in the same way that we think about building relationships with individuals. What does that company want to accomplish with their volunteer time with their employees? What do the students need to accomplish, or what does the university want students to accomplish with their service learning hours? And try to, again, make that match so that we're balancing the motivations and what's meaningful to corporate volunteers or student volunteers with what the organization needs. I think sometimes we fall into that trap of you'll just bring in a busload of volunteers from the corporation and they'll paint the walls and then they'll take their photos and get back on the bus and go back to their office. But if you don't need those walls painted, it's a waste of your time and your organization's time and resources. So we need to start those dialogues, that conversation with what you can provide to those groups of volunteers or to those other corporations or community groups, and what they need to bring with them. So, you know, yes, we'd love to have your group of 50 or 100 come and do this, but we can also really use some help around HR management or marketing so that it becomes that really intertwined relationship. We know from the work we do at Volunteer Match with the companies that we work with, organizations, companies are looking to build that multifaceted relationship with organizations in their community. They don't want to do single-day event volunteering with one organization and put volunteers in leadership development positions in another organization and fund a third organization. They want that to all be one organization. So come to that conversation with multiple ideas for how you and that company can work together. And, you know, the funding part is always a little bit trickier, and that sort of falls into what your organization believes around, you know, is it a pay-to-volunteer kind of situation, or are companies expected to provide money for resources or supplies, whatever might be needed. And that's an individual conversation with each company. Some are willing to that, some are not. And then, again, building that multifaceted relationship with an eye towards a long-term relationship is probably the best way if you're looking for that funding capacity.
Great. Let's see. Next up, Cheryl says this, and I think she's talking about the idea of volunteers, you know, wanting to have information and feel part of the program and be appreciated and all of that. So she says, this applies to VISTAs too. My sense is that many of us, myself included, feel underutilized. Will you speak to this? And Jennifer, I'm not sure how much you can speak to that, seeing as you're not in the VISTA
if you want to jump in there, Andy, that would be great.
So I'll just say a word or two here. And in fact, you know, in a lot of regards, VISTAs are volunteers. I mean, our name, Volunteers in Service to America. So, so there can be that sense that that maybe you have skills that aren't being utilized, that maybe you've been given your assignment description and it's not enough to keep you challenged and busy all day. And the great thing about the VISTA program is that there's a lot of flexibility, and that you as a VISTA member can set the agenda for your own service. So within the construct of your VAD, you can actually build your work plan. You can sit with your supervisor. You can propose ideas and projects. You can come up with what your day-to-day looks like, and you can then figure out just how far you go in a particular direction with a particular aspect of it. So if you have skills that you feel are not being utilized, I would say come up with ideas for how you could utilize your skills. What do you see the organization needs that you could take care of? Go to your supervisor with a solution in mind. You know, I think if you come in and propose a solution, much more likely that you'll get approval for that and that you'll be able to engage that way. It works very well with volunteers too. So with regular community volunteers, as Jennifer was already saying, you're going to want to create the environment where they can come with ideas for how to accomplish other things at the organization or how to solve problems that they're aware of. And that applies to VISTA members as well. So, Cheryl, I hope I did your question justice there. But in the interest of time, we're going to move on because I know we have more questions than we're going to be able to answer. So let's see. Michael has a question. He says, I'm curious about your experiences with volunteer onboarding. This is where most volunteers, I guess in his organization, fall off. We require live scan background checks and orientation and application and sometimes a tuberculosis test. Is there any way to streamline this work? Our team is small.
Yes, certainly we want to make sure that we're addressing risk with hand scans and with the tuberculosis tests. Sometimes those can take a while. You might think about shifting the order in which those things happen. So it might make sense to do that initial screening, the initial orientation, find volunteers who are a good fit for the work. Then after that process, put in the tests and the background checks, and maybe start training at that point with the knowledge that if something comes back, the placement and actual volunteering is contingent on clean background check and a clean TB test. So that there's something for those volunteers to do. They're starting to get involved in the process a little bit more, and they're learning a little bit more. And then having those conversations ahead of time. Not everyone will be honest with you, but if you give them the opportunity to say, hey, this might come back, or, there could be a problem here, is that okay? You're addressing any of those issues up front, and then giving those volunteers an opportunity to start learning, to start being part of your organization, so that when those test results do come back or the background check comes back, they can hit the ground running. And instead of having that be that waiting process, that there's no connection already to your organization, it's easy to wander off or find something else to do with your volunteer time.
Great, thank you. I'm going to touch base with Terry to see if we have any callers on the phone.
Sir, at this time I'm showing no questions.
Okay, we've got a few more here, so we will keep moving on. Madison says, my service site is a small private university, and most volunteer opportunities are through community organizations. What is the best way to engage university students in volunteering at community volunteer opportunities?
Certainly we want to think about that flexibility, right? College students may have availability one week and then not the next because of exams or changes in terms. So thinking about what things might be able to be done either in sort of a project-based format or in a really self-contained kind of format. That would be a good recommendation. Also, a lot of it's the same, helping volunteers, college students as volunteers, understand sort of how they're making an impact and why this should matter to them. So that could be impact for clients or the community, or it might be skills to put on a resume or an opportunity to test out an impact area or a working environment that they might be interested in. Volunteering in a hospital if they're considering being a medical professional, volunteering in a school if they're thinking about being a teacher or working in education, to get a sense of what that's like when they leave the university and move into the working world. But again, a lot of it's asking too, trying to figure out what works with their schedule, what they're interested in, and then building those strong relationships with those other community organizations so that your expectations and the community-based organizations' expectations are being managed about when students are available and how they're available.
Great. And Beth has a question about volunteer recognition. She says, is there evidence for what recognition techniques actually increase retention and engagement? I saw a lot of ideas here, but which ones are worth our effort?
So unfortunately, there isn't just a single answer for recognition. Just like motivation with volunteers, how volunteers want to be recognized, this can be very unique to them. We want to try to get to that as much as possible, and this is a great, again, opportunity to bring in volunteers to maybe create that recognition team and help them incorporate impact with that recognition so that it's not just, here's a coffee mug, thank you so much for your time. It's really showing a volunteer what they've accomplished and how something's different for your clients or for your community because that volunteer was there. Some volunteers want plaques and awards and celebration, and some want to stay behind the scenes. You know, maybe it's handwritten notes, which we never get anymore, or notes written by clients or by paid staff members that volunteers work with, really talking about the work that they're doing. I would encourage you, if you feel like you want to figure out what the most effective recognition is in your organization for your volunteers, ask them, maybe a survey or a team that sits down with volunteers and says, what we're doing now, do you like this? Is this working? Do you understand how much your work matters to this organization? What else do you want to know? And I would think about things like professional development or ongoing training, inviting volunteers into things like town halls or inviting them to sit in committee meetings or even staff meetings as an opportunity to show recognition as well, that they're an important part of your organization and are invited in. So don't just think about those traditional parties or annual brunches, but really start to dig in, you know, access to special information, access to special people in your organization. All of those can be meaningful recognition opportunities as well.
Great. Thank you for that. It's all the time we have for questions, so I apologize if we didn't have time to get to your question. And I want to thank everyone for participating with us here today. So first of all, thanks to Jennifer Bennett from Volunteer Match for all of your expertise and for sharing such tremendous information with us today. I also want to thank Charlotte Castro from Georgia 4-H, our VISTA alum, for coming back and sharing your experience and expertise with your fellow VISTA members. I also want to thank our production team at JBS International and Education Northwest, Sam Graziani and Bethany DeSablin, for their help with the technology today. And I'd also like to invite you all for our next webinar, which is on managing student loans, coming up April 14th, 2 p.m. Eastern Time. You'll be receiving an email invitation with a link to register. Of course, you can always find our upcoming webinars listed on the VISTA campus. So thanks again for your participation today. We look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thank you.